Today we have Dr. Barbara Magalhães Teixeira. She's a PhD, she's not a doctor yet, she's a PhD candidate in Peace and Conflict Studies at the Department of Political Science at Lund University, Sweden. Her research looks at the relationship between the environment and peace and focuses on the possibilities of building sustainable and peaceful society. Her research touches on issues such as extractive industries, economic growth and development, land reform and redistribution, peace processes and negotiations. Besides her academic work, Barbara is also interested in critical pedagogy methods and the role of researchers in academia in questions of environmental and social justice and on building peace. So without further ado, Barbara, would you like to unmute yourself and begin your talk? Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll start by sharing my screen so we can get started. Can everyone see it? Yeah, okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. So my name is Barbara Magalhães Teixeira, and as said, I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Lund University in Sweden. Before I begin my talk, I would like to thank everyone at Scientist Rebellion for the invitation, especially Aitskoa, who is my colleague at Lund University and at the Institute of Degrowth Studies. But I also want to thank everyone at SR who have been putting this whole event together and making sure that everything goes well today. I also want to thank Anouk, Abel, and Lilu for providing the translation. I am so happy and so honored to have been invited to share a couple of ideas about my research and my work on the relationship between the environment and peace to such an important initiative that is really challenging the way that scientists and researchers have been involved in social and political organizing towards building a different world. But before I start, I would like to focus your attention on this beautiful artwork that I brought as a little conversation started for our discussion today. It is by an amazing artist, Molly Costello, who engages with very inspiring and powerful topics in their art, such as feminist issues, racial inequality, ecological balance. And what I think is the most powerful from her art is the ability to inspire people to envision other possible worlds. You should check out their Instagram and website because Molly makes her art available for educational purposes. So today, the opening message of the talk is that crisis expands our imaginations around what is possible. I will use this idea to inform my talk and our discussion today on how we should be seeing this breaking point of the climate crisis as an opportunity to imagine different worlds and different possibilities as well. And how does that connect to the idea of peace, and what role do we as researchers and scientists play in this movement towards building different sustainable and peaceful worlds? So a little way that I'm organizing the talk is by focusing on three different parts, with a main theme that we should be working towards expanding our imaginations. I'm sure that you are familiar with the quote that is often attributed to Frederick Jameson, where he says that it has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So we know that there's lots of imaginative futures about what the end of the world will look like. But when it comes to envisioning a world different than the one based on the capitalist structure, then it becomes very difficult to think outside of this very constraining structure. So then here, my first invitation is that we use our imaginations to expand our creativity and be able to imagine other worlds. And then the second thing is that we're going to be challenging the idea of progress tied to economic development through economic growth, through the intensification of resource extraction. And this is because this type of ideas, narratives, and activities, they are connected to both ecological breakdown, but also to economic, social, and political inequality, as well as violence and conflict. And then as a final as a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, a little bit of hope after all of this discussion, we'll be learning from different groups and communities about how it is possible to organize our societies away from fossil fuels, mineral extraction, and the growth imperative. And here I'm again inspired by this very beautiful and powerful piece of art that says that another world is necessary, possible, but that it is also already happening. So to get our discussion started, we need to address a very important question of what is peace. And working with the idea of peace is sometimes so difficult because even though everyone knows what peace is like theoretically, it is still very difficult to explain what it means because it lives in this very abstract level, right? And we can try and visualize or try to represent what peace is. But when we do that, it is often so context specific because we often bring it to a very personal individual level, right? So for example, for me, a person coming from Brazil, the definition of peace, of course, would be spending the day by the beach, drinking caipirinha with my friends and family. But that is a very personal way of visualizing peace, right? And then when we often see a definition of peace, it is in this connection to peace of mind or of tranquility, right? It is actually the first definition that I got when I Googled it. So the idea of freedom from disturbance, from of tranquility. But soon after this idea of peace, we connected to the idea of the lack of peace, right? We turn to the negative sense of it. So the contrary of peace, which is violence, conflict, and war. And I think that at this moment in time, this question of war and conflict has been very acute for many of us with everything going on in Ukraine and many other places in the world. So trying to understand how we can, well, understand peace becomes very timely. But I want to also start our conversation by stating that peace is not a neutral concept, but it is imperatively political, ethical, and ideological. So our individual and collective ideas of peace, they derive from the different ways that we see and that we understand the world, understand our relationships with people and with nature as well. And all of this is based on a diversity of values, of interests, and political agendas that we have. So here, I want to open the discussion about different types of peace, but also be very clear about what type of peace I'm talking about, right? So I will present a couple of different ideas about peace, but I want to provide a critical reading and a discussion about the implications of understanding peace in different ways. And I believe that the way that we understand peace is very important for how we can creatively envision it, because sometimes especially in times like this of war and of conflict and violence against women and climate crisis, sometimes it can be very hard and also very heavy to try and imagine peace, to see the hope in the future, right? But I hope that at the end of today, we can find some inspiration for hope and peace, actually. But to kick off our discussion, focusing on the relationship between sustainability and peace, this is something that has been growing over the last few decades, this attempt to try and look at questions of environmental sustainability and peace simultaneously. So one very important factor is that over 50% of all internal armed conflicts since the 70s have been connected to natural resources or to the environment in some way. We know that natural resources, fossil fuels, diamonds, mining, it can be related to the onset of armed conflict. But we know as well that these types of activities, they have a huge impact on the environment as well. So this goes both ways, right? And then it becomes then very important to address both environmental issues when we are thinking of building peace. So thinking about how do we want to build sustainable societies is merging this idea that we need to both build peace, but also address environmental issues at the same time. And then in a very international policy arena, we can see the example of the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, where it states that it is a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. So this idea, right, that in order to build peace, we need to take into account the environmental aspect of how do we build a sustainable society. And then, of course, coming from the field of peace and conflict studies, we're very much aware and very much worried or concerned with countries moving out of armed conflict and how natural resources and the environment has been affected or has affected conflict, and how we can then build peace in this very, very fragile context, right? So here one very strong theoretical claim in the literature is that if we can responsibly manage natural resources, we can use them to jumpstart economies, especially of developing countries and post-war countries, as a strategy to build peace and to build sustainable development. And I'm pretty much sure that you are familiar with these types of narratives of how do we go on about sustainable development, right? By using the environment, but also combining it with development strategies and economic growth strategies. So then what happens when we look at the relationship between the environment and peace in this way is that we have a very constrained vision of what the relationship between the environment and conflict looks like, and where does conflict happen, right? Where is peace needed? So my research for my PhD dissertation is about this relationship between the environment and peace more broadly, but I look a lot at civil wars that are fought over the control or the distribution of natural and environmental resources, or conflicts, for example, that are financed by like oil or diamonds, or that are aggravated by natural resources and climate change. And here I brought a map with the geographical distribution of which countries since 1970s have had civil wars that are connected in some way to natural resources and the environment. And here, like to give a little bit of context, a big part of this conflict is like land conflicts or peasant revolts in Latin America, for example, or in India. But there are also a lot of civil wars in Africa, for example, about like oil and mining and diamonds and different minerals. And here, the scope conditions for what counts as an armed conflict are very tight because of the very closed-in definitions of what counts as a civil war and an armed conflict and what counts as violence. So there might be the case that that's why there appears to be so few countries represented in this map. But one thing that I think is very important from the research in peace and conflict studies is the relationship between the environment or of natural resources and conflict is the idea of the resource curse, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it's this phenomenon that happens when we have countries that are very, very rich in natural resources, and sometimes even multiple types of natural resources, but they are still underdeveloped, and then they are also marked by a lot of violent conflict. So then there is this connection, or maybe what I would say is a misconnection, right, in the literature to assume that underdevelopment, the reason countries, especially in the global south, as you can see the distribution here of countries in the map, is that conflict happens because of low levels of development, right? So then the idea is that underdeveloped countries cannot develop, and they cannot then prevent violent conflict because of their weak state capacity, because of corruption, and because of the failure of institutionalization or liberalization of governments and economies, right? And then this is often attributed to a lot of underdeveloped countries in the global south, right? And I'm pretty sure you are familiar with this narrative. And then one very interesting thing is when we look at the relationship between climate change and conflict. I don't know if you've seen the last IPCC, but they mentioned a lot of studies in peace and conflict about the relationship between climate change and armed conflict. And then we can see here from this heat map that we can see this pattern of where is the highest levels of climate vulnerability and how that is correlated to the incidence of armed conflict, right? So there is this narrative as well in the peace and conflict studies literature about this relationship between the threat of climate change and how that is connected to violence. And here we can see how that is also focused in very vulnerable countries of the global south, which are not only the hardest hit by climate change, but also by civil war and armed violence. And then here I want to make sure that even though we see this correlation and we see this pattern, maybe there's more behind it than what literature establishes as the connection. So here I will point out to the need to look at the historical development, right, of both climate change and the violences connected to climate change, but also of the institutions and the governments and the economies of countries in the global south, which are marked by history of violence, of military coups, of colonial legacies. So all of this very broad, very structural things, they need to be taken into account when we are trying to think about the relationship between the environment, natural resources, and climate, and the incidence of armed conflict. Because what I want to show you guys is that if we think that the presence or the scarcity of natural resources or of climate change is what causes armed conflict, then we come to this misconception. Then the way that we build peace is by increasing development, increasing economic development, economic growth. And then a lot of this is based on the ideas of promoting extractivism to jumpstart the economy of war-affected countries. And then this leads to what I call the unsustainability of peace, because these ideas, they're very much based on market-based solutions for like economic recovery and the expansion of liberal markets. And then it's very heavily built on the idea of promoting extractivism, right? And this is also very much tied to the idea of peace, that it comes from this very like economic understanding of the environment and of natural resources. So the environment then is understood as natural resources. So nature is something that we humans use for our benefit, for our development, and for our progress, right? So it's this very mechanic economic understanding of nature. And of course, that has in itself a lot of inherent contradictions between putting all of this economic, environmental, and peace goals together, right? Especially in such fragile contexts like countries coming out of armed conflicts, where a lot of infrastructure, a lot of institutions have been destroyed or have been weakened. So the argument here is that focusing on more extraction and on more of this economic development puts a lot of strains in the communities already. And here I brought two examples. The first one is of artisanal mining in the DRC in Congo. We know, for example, that a lot of the mining for the minerals that are used in our electronics, for example, they happen in conflict ridden places, and they are marked by a lot of armed conflict, the use of child soldiers. So this connection between the local conflict, the local environmental questions, to the larger supply chain, to the larger aspects of the global economy is very important that we put this together. And also, I brought the case of the palm oil plantations in Colombia. So after the conflict, there has been a lot of discussion on how to substitute the illegal crops of that the rebel groups in Colombia relied on. So a lot of this is being done through substituting coca to a huge agribusiness model of like palm oil plantations. And this is of course based on a lot of international demand, especially from societies of the global north. And then this is sold as a much more sustainable practice. But what happens is that a lot of peasants, indigenous communities, they are dispossessed of their lands. And then all of this very organic, traditional agroecological practices, they are being turned into huge agribusiness systems that is also seen as an extractivist practice, because it overuses the soil and the environment, and also is focused on exports instead of bringing or like feeding the local population, right? And then here the problem or the danger is that peace then becomes not something that is liberating, not something that is helpful or beneficial to the population, but it becomes oppressive, right? Because it is built over very oppressive, violent structures of economic and environmental exploitation. So here I bring a quote talking about how, in this case, peace is used as an instrument of expansion of neoliberal globalization and the Western hegemony, and as a way to control the convulsive areas of the global South and to guarantee the security of the international order. So the way that we understand conflict, especially in the global South, and the relationship to the environment, is that this underdeveloped communities and nations, they are unable to control themselves or to govern themselves. And then we need to implement a lot of neoliberal policies most of the time to make sure that peace can be achieved, or that liberalization and democracy and all of this liberal ideas can be brought to different communities of the global South. And here what becomes very important is that we challenge this myth of progress, right? That we as humans, we are masters of nature. We are nature exists as to do services for us, right? We can think about like ecosystem services and those kinds of things, about how nature serves us and our progress and our development and our economic enrichment. And then this, of course, has a lot of very racist and colonial undertones, right? Because a lot of this idea of development, this discourse of development, is input into different communities of the global south, and then made to follow one role of what does a civilized type of people or community looks like, right? Which is an industrialized, Western, modern, capitalist type of society, right? So then here I brought two quotes that I think speak very well to this this critique of this colonial myth or the narrative of progress, right? And I'm sorry, it is a bit long, but the first one talks about how there's a picture of complete lack of control and disorder in the third world, whose inhabitants, by some irrational logic of nature, have found themselves endowed with resources that they cannot or do not know how to deal with in an orderly manner. They envisage a paranoid fear about the unruly third world, a landscape of apprehension, risk, and insecurity, where conflicts could only be resolved for one and all if either state-owned or multinational corporations take over the control and ownership of mineral resources and manage them in a systematic manner, in the process putting their profits first and taking over the control of what should rightfully belong to the communities. So this talks a lot about how this idea of conflict and the lack of control over the environment is seen in countries of the global south, right? And how the solution then is to apply and to implement and to expand the capitalist market and this very economic way of mercantilizing the natural resources. And this is the one way to build peace, right? To build a civilized society. And then another thing that I want to bring to you is that the myth of Western modernity, of capitalist progress, and of this Eurocentrism is the belief that the colonial hell imposed on others is the road to a civilized paradise. So thinking about implementing or forcing this one way of living life and understanding how the world works into an infinite amount of different groups and different traditions and different cultures, and how this has been the history of the colonial history of the world, right? But to understand as well the violent process that this is in itself, not only that it causes conflict, but it is a violent process in itself, both to the people, to their cultures, but also to the environment. And here, to open up our conversations and bring it back to the idea of peace, then who do we think in this context, who do we think is living in peace, right? Or peace is for whom? Who do we build peace? And of course, I talked about the exploitation of both people and the environment. And then this is a very anthropocentric view of peace. The peace is only for humans and not for nature, for example, because for us to live in peace, we have to have this certain standard of living that is very based on a lot of consumption and extraction of resources, right? Without thinking about the environmental degradation and the violence against nature. But then is to think that when we think that peace is for humans, of course, not all humans are included, right? And this is a quote from a documentary that really inspired me and changed the way that I thought about peace. And it comes from Ailton Krenak, which is an indigenous leader and activist and a very important Brazilian thinker. And then he talks about how indigenous communities and their land, their territory, have been under attack since the colonial invasion of the Americas in this case, right? And then that for him and for his community and for other types of communities that are under attack all over the world, this idea of peace is a lie, right? And then he talks about how the ideological falsification that suggests that we have peace is for us to keep the thing, so the system, working. And then he says that there is no peace anywhere. It is war everywhere all the time. And of course, when we think about peace in this way, and when we think about the context of the environmental degradation and the attack on indigenous and traditional communities all over the world, we see a very different picture of what peace and what war and what conflict and violence look like, right? So in a contrast to the previous maps that I showed you, I bring down this one, which looks at environmental conflicts in a very broad sense, right? Where there is local contestation between different groups, maybe local populations and the government and industry, about different types of resource extraction, or nuclear energy, and commercialization of water, and land grabbing, water grabbing. And then here we see a much more global distribution of this type of conflict. And then we can see, of course, that if we understand peace in a broader term, and if we understand conflict in a broader term, then this is not something that is only important or is only necessary in the global south, right? In developing countries. But there are environmental conflicts and violence against people and the environment happening all over the world, even in the developed world, right? And of course, I mentioned that I'm from Brazil. So as you can expect, there's a lot of cases of environmental conflicts in Brazil, thinking about, especially under the awful presidency of Bolsonaro, about how so many environmental and indigenous groups have been attacked by trying to defend their environment and their territory. But then thinking about where I am right now, which is Sweden, and which is seen as one of the global leaders for peace, right? We see that there's also conflicts happening in Sweden, and most remarkable, I think, is the conflict over land in the northern part of Sweden, where international mining companies are trying to grab land from indigenous populations in the north of Sweden. So you see, we have to break a little bit this this idea of where does war happen, and I think we've been really tested by this idea since the war in Ukraine, right? And I don't know if you've seen some of the reporting from Ukraine and the refugees, and comparing the refugees in Ukraine to other types of refugees, from brown and black refugees from the global south, and you see the difference in how they're treated, right? So seeing war so close to Europe has really shaken people up. And this is exactly what I want this map to do to us, is to understand that war and conflict and violence, they happen all over the world under the current system that we are living in. And then here I just want to show you a little bit, or talk about different types of violence. So of course, when we talk about war and conflict, we're talking about this direct type of physical violence, right, which is connected to armed conflict and organized violence, and that is taken as an abnormality, an aberration, an anomaly in society. But then there's two other types of violence that are a little bit more invisible, and this we can see in the little table and illustration there. But then we have the type of violence that is structural, that it is built into the structure and shows up as unequal power, and consequently as unequal life chances. So here we can think about inequality and oppression, and why this is so more difficult to observe than direct physical violence is because it is taken as normal. Because both inequality and poverty and a lot of types of oppression, they are taken as normal, as the way that the world works, that the way things are. So then it's harder for us to question it. And then, of course, moving to the even more invisible side of the spectrum of violence is this idea of cultural violence, which is ideologies, theories, and discourses that legitimize direct or structural violence. So these are the ideas that allow for structural violence to exist, and that can lead, of course, to direct violence. So to think about some types of cultural violence, thinking about yesterday with the Women's Day, we have patriarchal values, right? They are a type of cultural violence that allow for the structure of our societies to be very gender unequal. And that, of course, leads to sexual violence, hate crimes, femicide, and all those kinds of things. So it is important that we understand how different types of violence are connected, and how then it is not only, we can't only look at the manifestation of violence, which is the direct type of violence, right? An armed conflict, a terrorist attack, but we also need to see the roots of this violence and how they inform a lot of our socio-economic and political structures as well. So moving to the, how do we think then about the climate and the peace? And here I built on the idea of climate resilient peace, which aims to advance both peace and environment sustainability simultaneously, right? And here it takes the idea of climate change as a violent phenomenon, right? Because not only it is responsible for a lot of natural hazards, but it also highlights a lot of rising inequalities. And then climate change is also felt differently based on this inequalities and this difference in vulnerability, right? And then understanding climate change and understanding environmental breakdown and this violence type of approach, we can understand that peace needs to transform societal power structures that are both driving climate change, but also the inequality and the violence. So then this idea of climate resilient peace is about negating all sorts of violence that I talked about in the previous slide. So the structural violence, the cultural violence, and also the direct physical violence. And here it is built on this idea of degrowth, that is this transition of a society where economic growth is no longer the center, and then downscaling production and consumption to enhance human and ecological well-being. And degrowth is not an economic recession or deprivation. It is, however, a purposeful redirection of societies towards an entirely different type of economic model, where a smaller metabolism centers around sharing, simplicity, conviviality, care, and the commons. And then here, the important things is that we redistribute power and resources, we reprioritize care economies, and that we focus on global equity, right? Thinking about who consumes and extracts all of the natural resources, and where climate change and environmental degradation are felt in the world. And then by looking at this, we come back to this emancipatory power of peace. Peace in this way ceases to be an oppressive force, an oppressive structure, but it becomes an emancipatory action instead. And then in this case, we need to realize and understand that power structures and distribution of resources in our societies are very important, because conflict is mediated by social, political, and economic structures. And those are gendered, they are racialized, and they are class-based. And then when we look at both all types of violence, we see that the most affected, especially by the hidden types of structural and cultural violence, are women and girls, poor people, and racialized communities in the global south. So then when we think of peace, especially from a decolonial perspective here, implies that we are approaching the organizational, communitarian, and popular processes whose goals are to subvert the economic, political, cultural, and social structures that are excluding, racist, patriarchal, and neoliberal through the implementation of peaceful action where the struggle for the well-being and alternative projects to the hegemony are highlighted. And then here, of course, is where the question of the utopia comes, right? Because here I'm talking about very strong, very hard and solidified and very violent structures, racist structures, patriarchal structures, capitalist structures. So then it can be very idealist, right? And I tell you this from experience that it can be dismissed as being very utopian, very naive, very, oh, you're so young to believe in this type of action and transformation, right? But my response to this is that we are living in a crisis of the imagination, that we cannot imagine differently from the current constraints that we live in, the current way that our societies are organized. And we can only understand peace within the boundaries of this Western capitalist structure. And then if we do it like this, then of course we cannot see peace as an alternative or a sustainable society as an alternative, because our model, our system is inherently violent and inherently bad for the environment, right? And another point is that, oh, this has never, or this has been the way that things are, and we can't change that, right? Or it doesn't work, or we have always done it like this, or but then I want to say that the past is not proof of the future. Just because we have done this for centuries now doesn't mean that we can't change it, right? Doesn't mean that there are other worlds that are possible. And also trying to dismiss this idea based on it doesn't work or the world works like this is really dismissing a lot of different communities and groups that have lived and have resisted Western capitalist expansion for centuries. So it's really erasing their history of resistance. So something for us to keep in mind. And here, what I mean by utopia is imagining a preferable system to the status quo. So freeing us from the determinism of history, of making sure that we have to continue our lives this way, we have to continue to organize our societies in this way. And then here it is important that we think of the possibility of real alternatives and galvanize socio-ecological changes to encourage a foregrounding and naming of different futures. And here, of course, I'm not talking about daydreaming, and I'm thinking about, you know, impossible worlds where unicorns are real, but here I'm talking about envisioning real and concrete utopias. And there are a lot of ideas out there that enable us to make this transition, that make reaching this utopia of a peaceful and sustainable future real, right? Because they already exist. I mentioned to you that there's a lot of groups and communities that have been resisting and have been living these alternatives for centuries now. And I think that we can be inspired by a lot of this, by their struggle and their resistance. So I wanted to bring some examples of this, where people and communities are resisting both colonization, but also the colonization of the environment. And a big source of inspiration to me is the Zapatista resistance in southern Mexico. So they have their own authority over certain territories and areas in southern Mexico, and they govern themselves and nature in a very different way, in a very communal way, where the people people orders or mandates, and the government obeys, which I think is the very really good way of organizing and is institutionalizing how we organize our societies. But there's also in Brazil, where I'm from, a lot of examples of agroecological communities of Buen Vivir, and also the landless movement settlements in Brazil, where they promote not only environmental ecological balance, but also they are very politically organized. They talk about feminism and decolonial thinking and racist issues, and they're trying to build different communities on how to organize themselves, but also their relationship to the land, to the environment. And of course, a very big inspiration to all of this is indigenous and traditional communities all over the world, right? In the bottom here, I have a picture that I don't think you can see very well, but it's of the northern part of Sweden, where the Sami people, they have established an decolonized zone where Swedish government and international industries are not welcome. And this is a no mining zone where they're trying to reclaim this area for themselves. And these other worlds are possible because they are real, because they exist, right? And of course, they're under attack from governments, from businesses, from different groups of people. But their history of resistance and struggle, I think, serves as an inspiration to all of us, and examples that it is possible to live a different life. And then to finalize my talk, I want to bring about the importance of the role of scientists and researchers in this struggle towards this utopia. And here I don't use utopia as a bad connotation. I think it is a really good, like, creative, imaginative exercise to believe that, or to understand that utopia is possible. But then what I want to bring to you is a little bit of reflection on critical pedagogy and the idea of praxis, right? So I think that for us as researchers and scientists, the point is not only to analyze the world, but it is also to transform it, especially in times of war, of violence, and of climate breakdown. And here, a very important point is this myth of the neutral scientist, right? Of the observer from a distance. I think that more and more we are understanding that we need to take action, and we need to take part of the change. And I think that Scientist Rebellion is a very important organization in doing this, in understanding that we as researchers, we are in a position where because of our work and because of our knowledge, we have to do more than just analyze the world. And here, very important is the work of Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator. He talked about how you can't only have theory without taking action, and you can't only have activism without theory and critical reflection. And a quote from his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is where he says that oppression is domesticating. So the way that science and research have been used so far to perpetuate the status quo, right, these very oppressive and violent structures, is a domesticating action. But to no longer be prey to its force, one must emerge from it and turn upon it. This can be done only by means of the praxis, reflection, and action upon the world in order to transform it. So it's very important that we work within these three areas, right? Of critical reflection, of building theory for transformation, and that we also take action on it. And then a little bit more of inspiration is this idea that freedom is a constant struggle, right? It's not going to happen from one day to the next. It's a very hard, very long road towards transformation. And here is the inspiration from a chant from the Black liberation movement in the US. And as a final message, I borrow from Angela Davis, who's also a big inspiration in both her academic work, but also in her political organizing, is that the idea that we have to do the work, even though we don't yet see a glimmer on the horizon that it's actually going to be possible. And I think that the point that we are all here today organizing together with other scientists and researchers is a very big indicative that we understand the importance of this, and that we are ready to take part of this change and this process of transformation. I'm very happy to continue talking about utopia and peace and what we researchers can do in our chat. So thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Barbara. That was really excellent. I think I could watch that 2 or 3 times again on YouTube and have a bunch of different points that stand out to me. There were so many different issues you touched on, so many different interesting perspectives you had, and good resources, and a bunch of points that I sort of touched on in my own research and analysis, but you made them so much stronger and more clear. And I particularly liked the last few points you touched on and slides you had in terms of example. So the utopia analysis that you had, obviously, but then leading on towards examples of groups that have been fighting a similar struggle for 200, 300, 400 years, and have kept a solid analysis through that whole time. Yeah, and then being able to tie that together at the end was really brilliant how you did that, being able to tie that together for what that means on the ground for us as scientists, and the fact that we're here engaging in these dialogues, these contexts, and being able to have an analysis that respects all of the points you touched on. Yeah, really fantastic. Thank you so much. I guess we'll move on to a question and analysis, question and answers part of the talk now. We had one question so far in the chat. I've got a few as well myself. If people want to put more questions in the chat, please do. We would love to get some points. We're going to spend about 8 or 9 minutes on this question section, so there is time for a few questions. I guess one that jumps straight out at me is having worked in renewable energy, we're now going to see a shift in the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years of taking up increasingly large parts of the world for building out renewable energy, which on the one hand is obviously a necessary part of a transition that we need to make, but we need to be very careful about not alienating groups of people and not having ecological impacts that we're not thinking about. And leading on from that, you mentioned about resource conflicts, and obviously a lot of the energy installations require quite a lot of resources, and particularly rare resources in their extraction. And a lot of these tend to be in places that, I mean, you showed the map of how sort of conflict escalates in places that are already under strain from climate and ecological factors, but also structural factors. And also, by the way, that slide you had about the different types of conflict, not just physical violence, but also structural and other forms, that was really good as well. So I guess the core of my question is, how do we go about making sure that when we are determined to build out renewable energies, that these don't escalate in areas such as, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and other places like in South America, for example. How do we avoid sort of a conflict situation in the pursuit of avoiding conflict that would arise from climate breakdown? It doesn't seem to me to be a completely easy scenario to solve.
Yeah, no, that's such an important topic that you raise, because we know how much our societies and our lives depend on energy, right? And especially now with the case of Russia, I think that we realize how we are dependent on fossil fuels, and how that has such clear direct impacts in our politics or economies, right? And how that is connected to war or the power to wage war. So this connection between resources and conflict and violence is such an important one. But what I want to highlight here in this process of changing the way that we power ourselves, our societies, is this idea that environmental struggles and the work towards sustainable societies, it cannot happen separately from social justice struggles. They cannot happen apart from gender struggles, about racial struggles. So all of this, they have to happen in a holistic and in a communal way. You know, you can't only build a lot of solar power plants and then dispossess a lot of native people, for example, because then this is when, like, when I talked that peace becomes oppressive, this is when environmentalism becomes oppressive as well, right? When we're only talking about the level of consumption and energy use of rich societies in the West, while the people that are dispossessed from their land and that have their environment violated, they are not benefiting from this progress, right, of modernity. So then that is why it's so important that when we think about this ecological transition, that it is not only an ecological transition, but it is a social ecological transition, because these types of struggles, they have to be taken together, because if you take them separately, then you run the risk of being oppressive in other ways. That's why I think it's so important that we understand the connections of the different types of violences, right? And we are so focused on the direct physical violence because it is the most shocking one, right? That we don't understand the violence of climate change, the violence of economic growth and of resource extraction and of capitalism. So how we need to really tackle this structural issues as well, instead of promoting some isolated activities.
That's a great answer and a great analysis. I think one thing I would say in response to that is we notice with the citizens' assemblies and the various organizations that sort of grapple with this problem is they have a much better analysis and come to much better conclusions and say some of the things that you say in a similar way when it comes to discussing how we go about an energy transition, how we go about an economic transition, whereas the sort of main the existing political structures never mention any of these topics you're talking about and don't come to reasonable conclusions with these facts in mind. I think that's something that speaks very much for participatory democracy and direct democracy. Yeah, exactly. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just want to say that that's why it's so important that we as researchers and scientists, we are in connection with these groups, right, that they are doing the work on the ground, because then we can combine action and political discussions with our theoretical, empirical analysis, right? That's where the transformation happens, because if you're separated, that's when the system continues to be the way that it is, right? And that's why it's important that we are in this conversation together.
Yeah, perfect, thanks. We need to move to the last couple of questions very quickly. Ulrich, do you want to unmute yourself? And you had a question much earlier in the chat and you've just posted one now, so go for it.
Yeah, I was just, if you follow the recent EU African Union summit, the last, I think, since 6 years, there was all this craze about in the sunny south we can produce loads of hydrogen, Wasserstoff, green hydrogen, and ship it and put it into our cars and happily drive on and do like we did before, and it hasn't really been challenged, but well, I think you have already given the answer. Barbara, it won't change anything because it will not. The people where this Wasserstoff hydrogen is produced with. But anyway, yeah, maybe you have a comment. If not, I think it was a superfluous question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I would say. And here, I think we need to we can clearly see this like historical pattern of where resources are extracted and where they're consumed for the benefit of progress and humanity, right? We're just going to continue to reinforce this oppressive relationship that the environment and the people in the global south, they are going to suffer both the political, economic, and environmental consequences of resource extraction, while people in the global north are going to benefit from it, right? With social democracy and with welfare states and with high levels of living standards. And especially in Sweden, right, with this idea that we live in a very sustainable society, in a very ecological society, because but of course, right, there's a lot more to unpack. We really need to go deep into what are the relationships, both of power relationships, but also resource flows as well.
Thanks so much. We need to be quick. Fabian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Well, thank you for this wide-ranging talk. It reminded me a little bit of Amitav Ghosh's most recent book, A Nutmeg's Curse, where he sort of traces the planetary crisis back to colonialism and imperialism, and he makes that point that, you know, in the global south or in the global north, it's kind of treated as an isolated, you know, technocratic issue, and in the global south, it's just viewed as a continuation of imperialism and colonialism. And he notes that it's not the end of capitalism, but that is hard to imagine, but the end of the geopolitical dominance of the West. And I'm wondering, and you know, we've been talking about this a little bit now. You mentioned examples in the global south of, you know, utopias, so to speak, the Zapatistas and so on. And I'm wondering, how do you see that in the global north? I mean, so we can't, of course, what we can do is stand in solidarity and, you know, dismantle structures of oppression. You know, we had Esteban Servat here talking about Shell must fall, BP must fall, Total must fall, and so on. But I'm wondering, do you have also examples in the global north of, you know, like communities or organizations or structures that move away from the current system towards a more, yeah, an utopia, as you say it? Like, is it expanding the commons or, you know, things like that? So I'm wondering whether you can give a little bit more details on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that we can only work towards this transformation if we are building this international solidarity and these alliances, right? We can't let the already burdened communities in the global south to lead this transition. We also need to take part and do our job, right? And we that live in very privileged societies that benefit a lot from this exploitation of both nature and people, we need to understand our place, but also that we have a lot of power in promoting change as well, right? And there's a lot of power in you as a person that benefits from an oppressive system to like taking a step back and being like, no, like we need to change this. And then you need to work with people around you to build these alternatives. And of course, I think that there are a lot of alternatives, like around Europe. There's a lot of eco-villages. I know some of in Latvia, for example. So there's a lot of people bringing in ideas of agroecology to Europe as well. Here, where I live in Malmö, we have food cooperatives that are trying to work with local farmers, you know, to not be so dependent on export of food, for example. But I think that the main way we can work is in the global north, I think, is through these ideas of degrowth, for example, really trying to move our governments and our politics away from this imperative that we need to keep growing our economies, and then really focusing on building alliances with the movements in the global south. And like I said, and I showed the map, like a lot of environmental conflicts happen across Europe and the US, and right. So here in Sweden, I would say we need to really be in solidarity with the Sami people, for example, and across Europe and other places, we we can always find ways of building a community with local groups, local organizations that are trying to build alternatives like circular economies and sharing economies and those kinds of things. There's a lot for us to do, for sure.
Another great answer. Thanks so much, Barbara. There is another question in the chat. Maybe while Mike, so we're going to move to the next part of the talk now, and Mike is going to introduce a bit and talk a bit more about Scientists' Rebellion and some of the goals and aspirations that we have and what our structures are all about. But Barbara, maybe if you could try and respond to that with a written response while Mike talks, and take it away, Mike.
Oh, amazing. I thought Barbara was going to answer the last. Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for the talk. Thanks, Carl, for hosting, and everyone for being here. Yeah, that talk made me reflect. So maybe I'll start by just like what that made me reflect on. And then, yeah, as Kyle said, I was going to say about like who Scientists' Rebellion is, like why we're a thing, what we're trying to achieve, what we've done very briefly, and what we're doing in April, most importantly. So how you can help change the world before the world ends. So yeah, I was thinking a lot about war, naturally, obviously, during that talk, and just thinking about how I think something that's underappreciated is we've got one last very small chance to avoid essentially war, an exponential increase in war until it all goes tits up and we'll all die, to put it extremely crassly. If we don't have some kind of global climate revolution within the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to hit a tipping point. Things are just going to get worse, and then from now until social collapse, which will happen before the end of the decade, the end of the century, if we're lucky, we will just see more and more refugee crises, more and more war over dwindling resources, and it's just going to get, you know, it's going to be indescribably hellish. It's going to be a hellscape. And we're not going to have another chance. You know, we're not going to be able to be like, well, if we screw this up, then we'll try again in 50 years. That this is it. And this is a unique thing, part of the climate crisis, is that unlike other struggles, and that's not to demean other struggles, but other ones don't have a time limit. But this does. And we are, if not out of time, we have all basically zero time. Yeah, so it's do or die, very literally. So this is something that I think Scientists' Rebellion, almost all in Scientists' Rebellion would agree with. But what unites us generally is that we are scientists who believe in direct action, who believe that we gain credibility through taking direct action. And the converse is also true. If you want to say that the end of the world is basically the end of the world, that billions will die, and then you refuse to take any kind of serious non-violent resistance, then it's very hard to believe that person. If you really believed it, if you genuinely believed it, as you should, because it's true, then it wouldn't be a bother at all. If you were to say, you know, if you were to say, my house is on fire and my family are in there, but I'm unwilling to do anything to save their life, people will be like, what are you talking about? So if it's in the same instance where people say, well, we need action, the scientific community have been saying, we need action. And so, well, take action yourself and show what, lead by example. If you if you're the fancy pants clever person who understands how bad things are, then why aren't you the person who's first on the street? You should be doing the exact thing that you're asking others to do. Dismantle the fossil fuel industry, build alliances with frontline communities, all of these things. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. You go and do it now. And of course, the standard response is, well, my research is too important, and if my research didn't get done, then, you know, the whole of academia will crumble and all of that. But obviously this is not fair, this is not just, it's just an excuse. But more and more scientists are realizing that. You know, there's a lot of social pressure at the moment to not act because it's unusual. So you can run with these justifications very easily, you don't get much pushback, and if you say kind of silly justifications for not taking action, people won't say that's silly. But what we need to do is flip that. We need it to be that there's social pressure on scientists to act and academics. It needs to be that people say, why aren't you taking action? Why do you refuse to take action? Why are you saying things are so bad but refusing to give anything up? Let's be real, spending a night in the cells is not a big deal. What we're talking about is, you know, if we want to take war seriously, as we should, and peace seriously, then we should appreciate the price that we're scientist rebellion is asking people to pay is basically nothing, or it's very small compared to what's coming. So that was kind of a justification of scientist rebellion, but and kind of our kind of core messaging. So what we have done, so we started in September 2020 with an action at the Royal Society where we threw paint, and that was to show that we are against, we're not pro all scientists. There are scientists who are counter-revolutionary, and we're a revolutionary group, and there are some who will always act to support the system, and they will act against climate action. Groups like the Royal Society, who get direct funding from private corporations like, I forgot them, but I knew there was like a evil hit list, and obviously the government. So they're never going to say the government are acting in a treasonous, evil way. So that was part of that. After that, we've done lots of actions, but the next major thing we did was we leaked the IPCC Working Group 3 report, or parts thereof. And the reason we did that was to show, in part, was to show how much it will be watered down. So it's already kind of a watered down version of the truth of what we leaked, but it will be even more watered down. And that's being published, the final version, on Monday, April 4th, which I'll talk about in one sec. But that's a very important date when our rebellion starts. And then we did a major action in Madrid with about 20 scientists in September.
It was in October.
In October, and then in November we had our big action at COP26, where we blocked a bridge, King George V bridge, for 5 hours in total, with about 21 of us using a kind of chain lock-on technique. So 10,000 police officers, every other group was kind of stopped, but we were able to pull it off. And we even did 2 other actions, one at Scottish Power, and we did the teach-in, and then Tim floated down the river in a boat, and that was brilliant. Anyway, so the next, so basically we've been growing, and we've mostly been growing internationally. So we've been spreading, we're now mobilizing in 25 countries for April. And importantly, and very relevant to the discussion around Global South, we're mobilizing just as much in the Global South as in the Global North, at least in terms of numbers of countries. It's still the case that there's more power in the Global North, but we've actually just set up a project to establish actions between the Global South and the Global North in terms of, basically scientists going to the headquarters of a target company that's mining in some community in Argentina, and then having like a genuine partnership where you're not just building parallel structures, you're also just going and dismantling the structure that's causing the harm. Anyway, so in April, everything starts on April 4th, Monday, April 4th. So that's when this report is released. On that day, we also have strikes and occupations beginning around the world. We don't know exactly how many. I'm talking to the coordinator like today, but it's going to be over 10 countries will be beginning this. Then on Wednesday, April 6th is when the big bang happens. That's when we're expecting at least 25 countries to have on average 10 to 15 scientists taking arrestable direct action, at least in the Global North. In the Global South, if you get arrested, you get tortured and shot. So in the Global North, we are taking up our extra privilege and responsibility and putting ourselves at greater risk in some sense. So that will be around 250 to 300 scientists taking semi-simultaneous direct action around the world. COP, where there was 20 of us, that was historic. Nobody had ever done that. That was the first mass arrest of scientists over the climate crisis. And then our next action is going to be getting 1,000 around the world, right? So we're aiming big, but we're definitely on track for this. And if you're not thinking big, then you're not thinking big enough for the climate crisis. We definitely have to be aiming for some kind of utopia, or we're going to go to hell, essentially. So then Wednesday is the big actions around the world. So currently we're mobilizing in Europe, in the UK, Nordic countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, Netherlands, and then In Latin America, we're mobilizing in, I think Elena will know, Ecuador, Panama, Colombia, Argentina,
Chile.
and Chile. And then in North America, we have 2 actions. We have one in DC, one in LA. And then in Africa, we have Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, DRC, and Sierra Leone. So I may be slightly mistaken on that one. And these are all acting on the same day. And then 2 days later, on the Friday and the Saturday, we're going to do, instead of very high level action, we're going to do medium level action. So things like pasting scientific papers, doing teachings, doing legal demonstrations. So the idea is that we use the demonstration effect. The theory of like non-violence is people will see these actions on the Wednesday and say, well, if they can go get arrested, I can go paste some papers, right? You have this social pressure of seeing your colleagues or friends go and take this sacrificial action that you say, well, okay, I will feel bad if I don't at least do something. So a couple of days later, you have this opportunity, and we're hoping to get about 750 scientists involved in that. So for a total of about 1,000. It's worth knowing we're working with groups all around the world. So in the UK, we're working with Just Stop Oil, working with XR groups in most countries, also with Declare Emergency in the US. So we're very much looking to work with local groups. It's very kind of beneficial from both sides. Like we need like local experience and knowledge, but Scientists Rebellion gives groups kind of an authority or information around the crisis. So kind of generally groups we work well with. And I think, yeah, so that's the main plan for April. But then just wrapping up the next, that doesn't address the crisis. You know, it will be all well and good and historic and amazing to get 1,000 scientists acting, but that doesn't solve the crisis. What does though, or at least gets us a lot closer, is if we have, if we normalize civil disobedience within the scientific community. So as somebody in the group said to me recently, it's like, we need to do what Greta did to the youth. You know, it's now the standard for the youth to demonstrate. And it has to be that, I thought of this the other day, you know, it should be the point of doing a direct action wearing a lab coat. And I was thinking, we need to be at the point where the police are nervous of people in lab coats. It needs to be, if you see a lab coat, you wonder if they're doing direct action. You know, it has to be that we're on the right side of history. We're not supporting this system that, you know, this capitalist, evil, genocidal system. We're in genuine resistance to it. And, you know, that would mean things like scientific bodies endorsing civil disobedience, Nobel laureates being arrested. We need many more people going to prison. Once you have that kind of tipping point, that's when, you know, the clever people in lab coats are terrified. And if you see them terrified, you're scared too. And then I think the community would have lived up to its responsibilities, but nothing short of that.